Michael, thank you very much and welcome you to the podcast. Thank you for being our guest.
Delighted to be here, Dirk.
Yeah, no, I read all your books. They were a great source of inspiration, and I will basically take them in the show notes so people can look them up. So, Michael, my first question is, why did you decide to write the first 90 days in 2003?
So there's two answers to that question, Dirk. There's the answer that for many years I thought was the reason I did it, and then there's what I think I've come to understand is the real reason I did it. And the original one was I was teaching at that in those days at Harvard, and I was teaching a program on organizational change. At that point, I was at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, actually, but it was a sort of public-private change program. And someone asked me a question basically about a change model I developed, and how would it help a new leader get up to speed. And I was kind of like stumped, right? So like, and that sort of got me thinking about transitions. And also I got to know a very well recorded leadership coach who did some work related to transitions, and we co-authored a book called Right from the Start that was published in 1999 before the first 90 days was published, right? So there was a book, a more academic book that came before the first 90 days. So that was always the story I told, right, about how I ended up doing it. But the real reason why I think I'm so interested in transitions and making successful transitions is that I moved every year between the age of 3 and 10. Right. My dad was doing construction projects for power utilities in Canada, which is where I'm from originally, in Ontario. And so every year we would pick up and we would go to a new place, and I would join a new school. I'd leave behind people. I'd meet new people. Even when I got back to the town we were originally from, I went to 3 different public schools, right, to finish up my public school education. So I went to 8 different public schools, basically, right? And I think that, in retrospect, I learned a lot about how to make successful transitions into new situations, right? Because anytime you do that, you've got to figure out, the politics and the culture of the place you're entering.
Yeah.
You've got to figure out how to find your niche within the context of that place. And I evolved some strategies basically for doing that, right? I was always a pretty bright kid, so I was always top of the class. But that can make you a target, right? If you're the new kid in town. And so I started very early helping other kids with their homework, and really being, kind of almost an educator. And of course,
Okay, kind of as a consultant to help
yeah,
the vision. Yeah.
yeah. And I think it's a way to build relationships and alliances. And I sort of view that as how I ended up being an educator as well as interested in transitions, Dirk, right? Because I think that reflex, but also that adaptive strategy for how to survive through all that was in part about helping other people, right, and helping other people learn. So that's the deeper, I think, the deeper resonance, right? I mean, there's always been something about transitions that has drawn me, has
Yeah.
pulled me right towards them, and I think that I think that's probably the experience that really was, what shaped all that.
Yeah, because going through this experience in your as a child and through your youth, basically, did that provide you with, let's say, the context to look at managerial transitions when when you started to study business and looked at businesses, etc. The moment that you suddenly saw a lot of parallels chopping up.
Exactly right. And transitions, as you know, because you do work in this area,
Yeah,
they have very similar characteristics, right? You're leaving behind something. I mean, if you know William Bridges' work
yeah,
on transitions, you're kind of leaving behind something. You're in this intermediate state while you're figuring things out, and then you settle into the new place. My wife is also a coach and researcher, sorry. And she wrote her first book on expat transitions, right? On
hmm,
how people make
yeah,
successful international transitions. It's a very similar dynamic. The only difference, and it's a big difference, is of course you're often bringing your family along with you. They're in transition too, which is a different kind of dimension, right? But transitions have similar characteristics, right? And I think understanding how to make transitions successfully helps you in a professional sense, but it also helps you in a personal sense.
Yeah. And if you look at the business world, because there is, let's say, the general perception that transitions often fail. Do you happen to have any data on the number of leadership transitions that fail, and what the financial impacts of these failures is?
So it's research that's really hard to do, Dirk, and I'll try to explain why, right? The best research on this has been done on leaders onboarding into new organizations. Because you can when you have that situation, you can tell here's when they joined, they came in from the outside, they lasted X amount of time, and the average is about 18 months, right, for people that leave. And then they go, and about 40%, well, the research that I did, along with Egon Zehnder, was about 40% of those people actually at that point in time left after 18 months. But of course, some of them decide to leave because it's not a great fit. Perhaps others, are encouraged to leave, and so
Yeah.
it's a bit hard to kind of get definitive numbers around it. The way I prefer to explain the impact, though, and again, it was research that I did jointly with two partners at Egon Zehnder, is, doing the right things to help people make successful transitions can get you up to full performance in about half the time it takes to do so unaided, right? And I think that's the payoff, right? It's funny, I've been thinking a little bit about some research I did originally on transition failures, right? And so the very first research I did way back when, on transitions was really about common traps that leaders fall into, mistakes they make and why they make them and what happens. And so failure prevention is an important dimension of this, but acceleration to full performance is as or more important. And if you can help people get up to speed in half the time, or you can help them help people on their teams that they're bringing in get up to speed in half the time, it's worth a lot, right? And I mean, there have been calculations done of ROI for this kind of work, and it's just so ridiculously high that you can't understand why everyone doesn't do it, right? Why every organization doesn't provide support to people, because there's absolutely rock solid evidence about the impact and about the magnitude of the ROI in doing so, right?
Yeah.
You help one senior leader make a successful transition, right? You think about all the impact of a failed transition, not just on the leader, but on the business, right? And the opportunity cost for a business of having a leader who isn't being successful.
Yeah.
So I think but there is this central mystery, I think, Dirk, of why even still more organizations don't invest in this.
Because my point is a little bit, having read your book and some of the statistics that you put forward there, and we might touch on them a little later in the podcast. The question poses itself: what is the reason why many companies pay so little attention to leadership transitions? I mean, do they consider this? And I think you also referred to it in your book, a kind of Darwinian test, in the sense of we've all gone through this ritual, through this kind of fire. We made it. You have to go through the same thing as well. Is it basically the fact that they don't know how to handle this from a technical perspective? Do they underestimate the issue? Because especially if you think about external hires, that's usually quite a complicated search process. Someone is already in a great position. You need to engage
exactly.
an executive search firm to get someone in. The cost, the transition, the effort is relentless. And then it's a kind of, well, this is your office. Welcome. Here's my number.
Yeah, good luck. Right?
Yeah, good luck. So what's the reason for that?
Good luck, have fun, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what do you think for that?
Well, so it's such an interesting question, right? And it's one I've thought a lot about. And there's, I'll just a couple of quick observations about it, right? So organizations often spend large sums of money with executive recruiters to identify a good candidate to bring in from the outside, right? And then they invest almost nothing in helping that leader be successful in integrating into the new organization, right? And that's always been a bit of a puzzle to me, right? But I think it's kind of we've already made this investment. we don't want to make even more of an investment to do that. So I think there's a part of that. I think there's a piece that confuses onboarding with integration, right?
Mhm.
So again, some work I did way back when, right? But many organizations do a good job of, in quotes, onboarding people, by which I mean signing them up and giving them technology and, giving them access and
Putting them on
orienting
the
them
payroll. Putting them on the payroll.
putting on the payroll, right?
Yeah.
Orienting, doing basic orientation of the business,
Yeah.
but pay very little attention to the actual process of integrating someone into the organization in a way that brings them up to speed quickly, right? And that's the piece that I see often missing, Dirk, is that emphasis on integration, right? If you look at, executive onboarding processes, they often are okay around the sign up and the orientation, but fall down badly when you get to the integration part of the equation, right? And in part, I think one explanation is, first of all, that's challenging to do. But second, it's not clear whose responsibility in a typical organization that is, right? Talent acquisition tends to let go, right? Once they've
Yeah, the
acquired the
KPI
talent.
is done once the contract is signed. Yeah.
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 So then is it the operating unit that owns the new leaders integration? Is it HR that owns the new leaders integration? Is it learning and development who owns the new leaders integration? And I have this mental image of kind of this whole between those various organizations into which this falls, right? Because it's a bit of an orphan,
Yeah.
it's a bit of an orphan, to see, and if you don't have a sense of who owns it, and if nobody owns it, then it doesn't happen, right? It just doesn't happen. So I think that's one explanation too. And then I think there's this difference between levels of leader, and this difference between internal moves versus hiring people from the outside. And your background is in coaching and consulting, and so I guess I would say I want you to imagine a 2x2 matrix, right? Our standard coaching tool. And one dimension of the vertical dimension is lower level leaders versus higher level leaders, right? And the other dimension is, hired from the outside, promoted from the inside, right? And so the box over here is high level leaders promoted internally, right? And this box down here on the diagonal is low level leaders hired from the outside. These folks get the most support in their transitions. Low level leaders being onboarded with standard onboarding processes get the best support, and I've done research to support this. And those internal senior leaders get the least. And that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because these folks have such a large impact, right, on the business. And maybe we can talk about it. Those internal moves are as or more challenging than coming in from the outside, right? And so we can talk about why that is maybe a little bit too. So I think it's a mixture of these things. I think onboarding is an orphan, right? It's a little bit of whose responsibility is it, and it's nobody's really, and it's certainly nobody's number one responsibility.
No,
it's not
no, correct.
the first.
Yeah.
Dirk does not wake up in the morning thinking, how am I going to successfully onboard leaders into my organization, right?
No.
So that's part of it. I think part of it is, again, that missing of the integration part of the process. I think there can be cultural dimensions, right? This kind of sink or swim culture. You're a leader.
Figure it out.
Lead. I think there can be a piece of that goes on. I think that paradox of providing good support to low-level external hires and lousy support or no support for internally moved senior leaders. I think that comes packaged with a set of assumptions that these people don't really need support, right? They don't really need it, right? Because they know the organization, they know the politics, they know the culture. How can they possibly need support when taking a new leadership role? Because that's what they're paid to do, right? To be leaders. So I think it's a mix. It's a melange of those kind of factors, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Because what I wanted to zoom in a little deeper on is what you already highlighted. There's a general assumption that internal moves are much easier than internal external ones, right? And the reason is people stay in the same company, remain part of the same culture, keep part of the same network, etc.
Exactly.
However, and that was stunning material for me to read in one of your books. You wrote that moves between units in the same company are rated to be 70% as difficult as joining a new company. Why are
Yep.
internal moves so difficult, and why do they often fail?
Yeah. So I think there's a again a few different factors that are important here. And one again is kind of the assumption that leaders moving internally shouldn't need that much support, right? Because they know the company, they know the culture exactly the same way that you said. But if you move to a different unit of the same company, you leave behind your network and all the political capital that you built up in that network. You may think you're going to the same culture, but you're probably not going to the same culture. You're probably going to a different subculture
Yeah,
within the organization. And people can miss that sometimes, right? You really need to prove yourself. The fact that you're coming from another unit may itself be a problem, right? Like, why is this guy coming from Unit A, Dirk? Who is this Dirk guy coming from Unit A? Why don't we have someone from our own organization, promoted into that role, right? So there can even be that sort of factor, I think, that can play a role here. But the net, and this was your quoting research I did on this, right, about assessments of relative difficulty, that research showed what you just said, right? That on average, people assess the move between organizations or units of the same organization as being 70% as difficult as joining the organization from the outside, right? For the reasons I just talked about.
yeah,
But even if you're promoted in the same organization, right, that doesn't mean that's an easy transition to make, right? Because we know, and maybe we'll get into this, but it's the what you need to do to be successful at the higher level may be quite different from what made you successful in the previous level, right? So it's not like there isn't this adaptive challenge that you need to face, right? Your leadership presence may be different. The politics may be more challenging. The way you communicate's got to be different because you're further from the front lines.
yeah.
How you delegate changes, right? So it's not like somehow, oh, a promotion, right? How hard can that be? Dirk's been promoted to lead, the people he
Nee,
was formerly a part of, right? I mean,
nee. Unfortunately, that part of your story really hits home to me. I had a fantastic job at the middle management level at a company, and then I was promoted to the most senior level, and the game changed completely. The change came completely. I mean, it was a completely different environment in terms of my
yeah,
leader, how he behaved, reaction from peers, things you were supposed to do. Yeah, it was a
absolutely.
complete integral change. It might have been a
Yeah,
different, completely different environment. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, no. So we as in my executive coaching company Genesis do quite a bit of work with Nike,
yeah,
and I was actually just on a session with the CHRO of Nike with a whole cohort of new vice presidents, right? And becoming a vice president in that organization is a very substantial change. And she was very articulate about how big a move it is because at the VP level, which is a very high level for them,
yeah.
all the expectations of how you show up are different, right? And having an enterprise wide impact is different, right? And so it's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the single biggest trap that leaders fall into is assuming that what made them successful in previous roles is going to make them successful in the new role. It's the number one trap.
Yeah, yeah, and it sounds like a cliche, but it's almost like they have to learn a whole set of new skills, and they have to unlearn a whole set of others. So
It's not a cliche. It's a
yeah,
very deep truth about the
yeah,
nature of these situations. But again, actually, I mean, I'm curious about the transition you went through because another dimension of this is you can be leading the people who were previously your peers, right? And so congratulations, Dirk, you've been promoted, and Harry and Sally and
yeah,
Betty and Edith, are all, not quite sure how to deal with you now that you're in the
yeah,
leadership role. And maybe Edith really thought she should have got the job.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And Harry, you and Harry never really got along super well. And so there's
Yeah,
a
that
whole,
puts it in an even more interesting setting.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That additional dimension of leading former peers, which is actually the book you mentioned, Master Your Next Move, has a chapter about leading former peers. It's quite a challenging situation to be in, right?
yeah,
That alone is an important transition that leaders go
yeah,
through. And I guess actually, if it's okay to say one more thing, that
yeah,
I think what also organizations sometimes miss is that they're actually asking leaders to make multiple transitions at the same time, right? You're moving to a new unit, but you're taking on a different function, or you're promoted to a higher level, or you're moving geographically, right? And your family's coming, and it's that layering of different kinds of transitions that can really make it super hard.
yeah,
And these days, and you're probably seeing it too. I mean, you come out of a sort of leadership oriented business, right? I see sorry, organizations making bigger bets on people. They're pushing people further, faster.
hmm,
And anytime you do that, you're usually asking them to make more transitions at the same time. And that inevitably ups the risk, right? And so I think another thing organizations miss sometimes is being really clear about the magnitude of the risk that you're asking a leader to make in making a transition. And if that level of risk is high, providing support, right? Because another way to think about it, Dirk, is to say, look, for the highest risk transitions that we're putting people through in our organization, high risk, high consequence, let's provide some support for them, right?
yeah, yeah,
But even those don't necessarily get the support
yeah.
they need, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I
Yeah. And
yeah.
if you flip it to the candidates, is there any homework that you would like to recommend to leaders who are asked to make an internal move? For instance, step into a more senior role, move to another business unit. So you got the offer. What kind of homework would you recommend them to do before saying yes?
Yeah. So that assumes they can say no, right?
Yeah,
which is not always the case, right?
yeah, correct.
It's
Yeah, yeah,
it's the Godfather, right? Make you an offer you can't refuse,
yeah,
or
yeah,
maybe you can refuse it once,
yeah,
but you can't
yeah.
refuse
But
it
then you
more than
find
that time.
yourself on another career track. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly, right. So
yeah,
so so often it's not quite that straightforward. In an ideal world, in an organization that does a good job of leadership development and assessment and has good leaders working with their teams, the fact that you, Dirk, get promoted should be kind of obvious to everybody. And you should be more or less ready because you've been doing parts of the job already successfully, right? That's the ideal world, right? And so and in that ideal world, the amount of homework you need to do is relatively modest, right? Especially if you're being promoted in place. If you are going to a different part of the organization, then it's about the homework you do for onboarding. It's exactly the same, pretty much, as if you're coming in from the outside. But I know, and I'm sure very few organizations do that good a job with identifying, assessing, and developing talent such that you are reasonably ready to make that move, right? And so then it puts it more on you to start to do the homework, right, necessary to be successful. And for an internal promotion, as we just talked about, a big amount of that homework is really understanding what success looks like at the next level, right?
yeah,
What should Dirk's presence look like at the next level? Who is it that exemplifies success at the next level, and how can I learn from those people, right? And then it can also be certain skill development pieces, right? It can be, okay, I'm further from the front lines, I need to communicate differently. It can be that kind of stuff. It can be my presence, the way I show up needs to change in ways that I can work on, right? It can also be, how do you start to get to know the key players at that next level, right? I mean, let's keep with the example of being promoted in place, right? So you're promoted to be in the position that your formerly was held by your boss, right? To your boss's peers, you're one of your old boss's children, right? And
Yeah.
and you've now got to build an entirely different set of lateral relationships
Yeah.
with those people. Now, again, ideally they already know you, right? Ideally they already respect you, but there's still work to be done to build that lateral connection.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it can be very dangerous sometimes because leaders tend to focus vertically during transitions, right? Up to the boss, down to the team, and don't necessarily focus early enough on the lateral
Yeah.
connectivity.
Yeah.
But homework wise, that is something you can do
Yeah.
some of right before you're formally enrolled, I think.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
terms of, yeah.
Yeah. No, that is very, very practical. Also, in your next move book, you identify the trend that more and more companies are looking outside for senior level executive. Oh, and yeah, I had two questions for me. My first question is, what is the reason that they look outside? And secondly, could it be interpreted as a signal that internal talent management processes fail?
Yes, and yes. So yes, and yes, and
Okay.
yes.
Next question.
So look, there can be situations where it makes complete sense to bring in someone from the outside,
Hmm.
right? You've got an organization that is in a turnaround state, right? And previous leadership has failed, and it's a crisis survival issue. Bringing in someone from the outside who then will bring a team in, typically from the outside, to kind of do a rescue mission makes complete sense, right? I think if you're in a business where because of maybe technology or market changes, you're kind of morphing into a different kind of business. The example I use for this is Nestle, right? Who came out of a very much of a food consumer business into more of a almost nutraceuticals, pharmaceuticals, a much more complex business, and brought in a CEO who understood those worlds, right? That can be a very rational decision on the part of a board, right? So those are good reasons to bring people in from the outside. The not so good reasons to bring people in from the outside are one you just identified, which is we've done a lousy job of developing internal talent and we don't have ready now candidates. That's a failure, in my opinion, at all levels. It's a failure at the level of the board. It's a failure, of the supervisory board. It's a failure at the level of the CEO. But it happens, right? Unfortunately, it also tends to happen more often where you've got CEOs who think they're replaceable, right? And have this sense that they should go on forever and don't really want to develop people who could replace them. I mean,
Yeah.
we see that sometimes, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I wrote an article recently about knowing when to quit, right? And when is it that a CEO should, you know,
Yeah.
exit?
Yeah.
And very few people have the wisdom, I think, and to know when to, their time has come, right? And also they don't necessarily invest in building the talent pipeline underneath them because they don't really want anybody to replace them, right? Because in their own minds they're irreplaceable, So that can be another reason why it happens, and that's not a good reason. And the other not good reason is, um, you know, you're just not paying attention sufficiently to the evolution of the business. You're not truly understanding what the needs of the business are in some sense, and so you're going for the savior, right? You're going for the bright shiny object outside because those outsiders often look, brighter and shinier than the
Yeah, you
people you
also
have
know
inside.
less about them, of course.
Well,
You
exactly, and that's
you
why, and
might
that's
you
why
might
that's
only know their bright shining side, and yeah.
oh, of course, right? You're almost by definition they're going to present the best face they can to things, and they may well have good track records, right? But you're taking a big risk when you bring in someone from the outside who doesn't understand your organization, doesn't have the history. And also, I think you said this earlier, Dirk, it also sends really negative signals to the internal talent, right? They kind of look at each other and themselves and say, well, why am I staying here if,
Yeah.
if there's not a prospect for me to go
Yeah.
someplace else
Yeah.
or go higher, right? So, yeah. But it's an interesting, so again, one of these very interesting, nuanced kinds of things, right? And I think the net is there can be really good reasons to bring an outsider, right?
Yeah.
Turnaround situation, industry evolution. There can be really bad reasons to do it. We didn't develop people, right? Or
Yeah.
we think we're focused on the bright shiny objects.
Yeah. And what homework would you recommend to leaders who are invited to leave their current company and join a new one? Because they're equally. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, compared to people who make an internal move, they might even have less information, and the delta they have to cover might be even bigger. So is there some homework you can recommend them to do?
Yeah, for sure, right? So, and by the way, just consistent with the conversation we had earlier, I'd make the same recommendations to people moving between units of the same organization, right? I mean, let's just call that onboarding, right?
Yeah.
And say, look, what's the homework you would do for people onboarding? And there are a few things, right? I think first of all, hopefully you did your due diligence during the recruiting process about the culture of the organization, right? Such that you're not walking into some kind of minefield without really understanding, right? That's what's going on. That you have clarity about the situation that the business is in. That you've had sufficient discussions about what your mandate is, like what are you there fundamentally to do, Dirk? How are you going to create value here? But that should happen during the recruiting process. And when it doesn't, it can be a real setup, right, for unhappiness. But let's assume those things happen. Then I think if you've got some time between when you accept the offer and when you're formally in the job, this is like gold, right? Because you're not in the job yet. You're not fully immersed in the flow of decision making and meetings. You can focus that time on learning. Now, by the way, I'm assuming there that you're not still doing your old job, right? One of the worst things you can do to people is have them overlap roles, right? It's a terrible thing to do, right? Because my belief is you should be focusing the transition period on getting up to speed in your new role,
mentally
learning,
preparing yourself for
and if what you're doing is wrapping up the old role, then you're not taking advantage of the transition period, and it's almost a setup for a kind of failure if you do that. So anyway, but back to the main question, right? So let's assume you do have some time before you're formally in the role. The agenda is learning and connecting, right? Your job is to figure out how to learn and connect as much as possible given the constraints of where you are. Sometimes you've got people who are on gardening leave and they can't engage with the new organization, right? So they've got to kind of operate at a distance. They've got to absorb whatever, information they can because they're not legally permitted, right, to be engaging with the new organization. But if you are able to do it, then I think, well, I'll give you an example, right? You will always get a set of documents from the organization. You'll get operating plans and strategies and financials and org charts and everything else, right? Right. You should be like an archaeologist with that stuff, right? You should dig into it and try to see what it tells you and what questions it raises for you and what hypotheses it generates for you. Because, there's often a lot of subtle signals in what you see there. Yeah, but this kind of doesn't align with that, and so what's going on?
We made this public statement here, and I see this graph going down. Yeah,
exactly, right. So and the metaphor I use is like archaeology, right? You're kind of reading you're seeing the fossils or the foundations or whatever it is, and trying to figure out what it all means, right? I think to the degree that you can meet with people, key stakeholders before, you should absolutely be doing that because what I say about this is every transition, every successful transition is sort of the foundation is learning and connecting, right? And so you should be learning and connecting as much as possible with that very precious time before you're in the new role. You know?
Yeah.
And there's some funny paradoxes with it too, right? Which is, again, this is just anecdotal, but I've seen situations where people will be more candid and straightforward with the incoming leader in informal meetings before they're in the job than they would be once the person's in the job, right? There's
Yeah.
something about the fact that you're kind of in this intermediate state. You're not yet the boss. You're not yet, in a position of authority where people will, for some bizarre reason, be more open with you about that. So you should take advantage of that. And
Yeah.
then, of course, once you're there, how do you accelerate the learning process? And not just the technical learning, but also the cultural and political learning. I'm working on an article right now about how do you speed up political learning, right? How do
Okay.
you
Oh, that would be great. Yeah.
learning? Yeah, how do you
Yeah.
learn more
You
quickly about
definitely need it. Yeah.
about the politics of an
Yeah.
organization, right? Which is super important. Who has power and influence, and why? How do I navigate through that? How do I build alliances? Those are kind of fundamental questions.
Yeah. Yeah, because one special case, and I don't know if you ever witnessed that, but it's something that I've witnessed quite a bit throughout my career, is that external hires are often brought in to shake things up. But then tragically, after a couple of months, they are being let go for the same reason. They shake up things too much. That's almost a kind of Greek tragedy in the making. Have you ever witnessed those type of situations?
Oh,
Have you been
lots of
involved in
times.
them? And what do you
Lots, lot,
recommend
lot.
to the different actors? Yeah.
So have I been involved in these situations? Have I seen them? Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
And basically what happens is, the organization decides that it needs a change agent, so it hires a change agent, and then
Yeah.
unfortunately the change agent comes in and starts making changes. And this causes resistance and disruption and reaction and so I think there's a couple of implications of this, right? I think if you're going to bring in a change agent, you want to bring in someone with a lot of experience about how to navigate through the change process and how to build support for the change process and how to understand the state of the organization, right? I mean, one framework I developed for the first 90 days was the STARS framework, right? Startup, turnaround,
Yeah. Yeah.
accelerated growth,
Yeah.
realignment,
Yeah.
sustaining success. Look, coming in from the outside, if it's a turnaround, yeah, yeah, awesome, right? Because everyone knows there's a problem. No one's going to argue that you don't need to take dramatic action. Coming into a realignment scenario as an outsider is super, super hard because I have to convince you, Dirk, that all is not well, right? And you
Yeah.
may be in denial about that, or I may
We
be
did a
doing
great
things.
job, and if some we always did a great job, and in a sense that things are not all right, and it's not we're not the ones to blame. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the changes I need to make have impact for the power structure. They have an impact for the status of people, right? And or even people's identities. And we know people will resist those changes more than they will almost anything else. So I think to be successful in that circumstance requires a great deal of patience and skill, right? And it also requires a great deal of support from more senior people. It typically is better done by bringing in not just one person, but a critical mass of people to try and make a different kind of change happen. I mean, being again, my little jokes, Dirk, right? But I when I teach about our change, and I know that's something you're deeply interested and involved in too. I always say it's very dangerous to be the sole source of pain in an organization, right? You don't want to be the sole source of discomfort, right?
Yeah.
Because you will then be the sole source of
Yeah.
the sole
You are a
target, right?
problem. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly, right. So I think, and then it gets in, I think it gets into stuff well around change management. It gets into stuff like pacing. It gets into things like how do you move people's minds along. It gets to the cultural capacity of the organization to absorb change. I mean, you know this stuff, and it's endlessly fascinating, right?
Yeah.
To do work in this area. So
Yeah. Earlier in our conversation, we discussed how expensive failed moves are for companies. And so very concretely, how can companies protect their investment in the talent they moved internally or attracted externally? What should adequate and good support look like to fully integrate them in the company?
Yep. So I think you're hitting on something first that I think is really important, right? Which is the right way to think about this is as a form of risk management,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
You're taking, you're taking a risk in putting this this leader into a new role. And there's very high associated potential costs with success or failure, right? If it were any other kind of business risk of equivalent magnitude, you would be very actively managing and mitigating that risk, right? But again, there's these weird things that somehow businesses don't perceive, that putting a leader in a new role, it is a decision with risk associated with it, and you should apply good risk management in doing that, including, okay, what are we going to do to anticipate potential issues and mitigate them, right? And the simplest way to mitigate them is to provide some level of support for that leader, right? I mean, obviously you want to select the right leaders to go into those roles, Dirk. I mean, that's job one, is making sure you've got
yeah,
talented people to put in it, right? But then if you think about it through a risk management lens, you say, okay, well, one thing we can do to reduce the risk associated with this particular choice is to provide some level of support for this person, right? And support can be, well, typically is a mixture of things the organization can do, but it's also often what external coaches and advisors can help with too, right? And I mean, it's a little self-serving, obviously, right? But I'm, for obvious reasons, a pretty big fan of bringing in experienced transition
yeah,
coaches to help with situations like this, in part because, leaders will, really kind of engage with those coaches and are able to say things and work through problems that they can't with people inside the organization. So
yeah,
you need a,
yeah.
you need a mixture of internal advisors and external advisors, I think, is the essence of helping people make a successful transition.
Yeah, because that brings me to my last question. Because besides authoring books about leadership transitions and strategic thinking, you also co-founded a consulting firm, Genesis Advisors. A
Yep.
couple of questions. The first question is the reference to Genesis. Where does that stem from? Why did you establish the company, and what are some of the activities that your company
Yeah.
does?
So that's a really funny story. So when we were thinking about founding this company originally, and this is quite a while ago, it was actually not long after the first 90 days was published that we started thinking about founding the company. And I told my mother about it, and she had a dream. And in the dream, the name of the company was Genesis. So we
Good,
called it Genesis, right?
good.
Now, I
Yeah.
mean, obviously Genesis also has, it has resonances of
Origin
beginnings
and
and
yeah,
the origin and stuff,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
But that's the real story, is my
Yeah.
mom had a dream,
Yeah. Now,
so there
as a
it is.
Jungian myself, I strongly believe in dreams. So yeah,
Yeah. So I took it as a sign, right? And I said,
yeah,
okay, good enough. As to what the organization does, so originally its focus was on transition acceleration coaching work, and also programs to help groups of leaders at lower levels make successful transitions. So, for many years I did programs globally for Johnson and Johnson for people at the, US company director level. That's not the European director level, obviously, right? So people just a step below vice president, typically in the US system. And I would go around and do these 2.5 day programs globally for people at that level taking new roles, and so that was the original focus of the business. We still do a lot of that, right? We've got a process we call acceleration coaching. We've got various flavors of one-to-one support. We've got a process called First 90 Days Express that is for groups of leaders going through transition at the same
That's clear.
time.
Yeah.
That includes peer group coaching and individual coaching, right? So that's still very much a part of the business. I think, the way I tell the story is you don't work with leaders for very long, taking new roles before you're talking with them about their teams, right? And how do you assess, right, and evolve that team into being the team they need? And I refer to it as repairing an airplane in mid-flight, right? You've got to balance stability and change, and so we moved, fairly naturally into team acceleration and development. So we have an offering we call the Team Development Accelerator that's all about that stuff. And then there's, we don't do a huge amount of work, but we do get engaged with both some focused leadership development work and some focused transformation consulting work, especially around culture, right? I'm personally particularly interested in culture transformation.
Yeah.
So that's the way the business has kind of, evolved, right? From first 90 days and transition support to teams to some leadership development. And also to this transformation work with a special emphasis on culture.
Thank you very much. I
Pleasure.
think, Michael, I just want to thank you for this interview, because I learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers and listeners will learn a lot as well. I thought it was very fascinating with a lot of, let's say, practical information. Is there anything we haven't covered, Michael, and any last thoughts or ideas that we haven't discussed and that you would like to like to say a little bit about?
So it's not a really big topic, Dirk, but one that comes to mind, and it's actually related to your question about how to prepare as you're coming into a new job, is really, to understand that you have a leadership brand and that people are going to go out and talk to the people who know the people who think they know you, and they're going to ask, well, who is this Dirk guy anyway? And so understanding what your leadership brand is and understanding how people inside your organization are likely to be thinking about who you might be, that turns out to be super important and something I'm thinking about these days. And it then connects pretty quickly to how do you want to show up early in the new role? What key messages do you want to send? Not so much about intention early necessarily, but about your leadership, right? And do you want to reinforce your leadership brand? Do you want to run counter to what people are thinking? That I think is a pretty interesting process.
Super. No, that's probably the topic for another podcast.
Sounds like it. Hey, listen, great to be able to talk with you, Dirk.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really, really enjoyed it.
Me too.
Super.